No matter how isolated, no matter how afraid, and no matter how alone you may feel today, know this, that the Department of Justice, and indeed the entire Obama administration, want you to know that we see you, we stand with you, and we will do everything we can to protect you going forward.
So as one state enacts anti-trans legislation, a top U.S. official advocates for the trans community. As we measure progress, how do we reconcile these two messages? Joining me now to discuss is Gina Rosero. She's a transgender activist and founder of Gender Proud, and Chase Strangio, staff attorney at the ACLU LGBT and AIDS Project. Chase, I want to start with you. Break it down for us. What's at stake with this legislation in North Carolina?
Yeah, thanks for having us, Alicia. The situation in North Carolina has really reached a critical moment. We've had a very intense legislative session where we've seen in states across the country trans people really being under attack. And then with North Carolina passing HB2, Governor McCrory signing HB2, and finally, after almost 2 months, the Department of Justice weighing in, essentially telling the government of North Carolina to either act or repeal this piece of very harmful legislation or risk legal action or losing federal funding for education, close to $4.5 billion. And rather than taking remedial action and thinking about all the trans people in North Carolina who are harmed by this measure, Governor McCrory and other lawmakers in the state really dug into the discrimination. And then the Attorney General made those incredibly profound remarks, and also with the force of the government, the federal government behind her, have now filed an action in court. And so we're going to see this issue really reach ahead around whether or not it's lawful under federal law for states to discriminate in this manner.
Gina, I want to get your take on something else that Attorney General Lynch said, making parallels to other civil rights battles in the U.S. Let's take a listen.
This is not the first time that we have seen discriminatory responses to historic moments of progress for our nation. We saw it in the Jim Crow laws that followed the Emancipation Proclamation. We saw it in the fierce and widespread resistance to Brown v. Board of Education.
Gina, if the community is constantly playing defense, if you are mired in these conversations about legislating bathroom use, what opportunities to go on offense to actually create progress are being missed?
When we talk about progress and what's going to happen, I think that the thing that we need to really also talk about is the Equality Act. When we do that, when we pass that, when we fully have the protection, not just for transgender people, but for everybody based on your race, when we have that, when we fully are protected, I think we could go from this conversation of always trying to defend or always trying to prove our existence to the world, and maybe we could have a conversation about thriving.
This is an extreme moment of visibility for the trans community, right? In so many ways, we're seeing characters on television, we're seeing people on the cover of magazines, and yet you have legislation like the legislation coming out of North Carolina, and you also have many incidents of hate speech, of violence against the trans community. I'm sure you saw recently this video popping up in a lot of our news feeds out of New York City. Take a look.
You ain't nobody. You a homo, gay mother, some women's products. Camera down, mother. Put the camera down, mother.
All right, so that's a video of someone on the subway verbally harassing Pearl Love, who's a trans woman living in New York City. Chase, how do you reconcile this moment where you have incredible visibility for the community with then the fact that you are getting this type of reaction both at the government level and at the individual level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we're in this moment where we're thankfully seeing the decades of resilience and resistance from the trans community, particularly trans women of color, culminating with a lot of visibility, with a lot of leadership from trans people like Gina, trans people like Laverne Cox, Janet Mock, really taking a center stage in these conversations. And of course, once we have people sort of staking their claim in public life, it invites all of this vitriol and backlash. And when the government of many states take their power to dehumanize and delegitimize the existence of trans people, it authorizes and emboldens private citizens to do the same.
Gina, you know better than anyone the power of storytelling. You became an activist through telling your own story in a very powerful TED Talk, which if you're watching at home, I encourage you to watch if you have not watched. And now you're partnering up with Fusion to tell even more of those stories in a new series about trans women of color and the challenges they face in seeking employment. Why did you feel this was such an important issue to cover?
You know, even when I started doing the work, and I knew from my experience growing up in the Philippines, we're not just changing legislation, we need to also change culture, right? And I feel like those two things has to work together. You can't just talk about statistic, and you can't talk about without talking about the people behind that. We need to humanize the experiences of those people. And in this very particular series that we have, like, I think employment and access to employment is one of the most critical things that trans people need, right? I mean, like, trans people experience unemployment twice the national average, especially if you're a trans person of color, it's 4 times the average. And I feel like these are the things that we don't get to talk about. You know, when people talk about trans tipping point, but when we see this series, we will know we're not there. Where is the trans tipping point, right? Like, I'm looking forward to that.
All right, Gina and Chase, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.